You know the landlord rang my front door bell. I let it ring for a long, long spell. I went to the window and peeked through the blind and asked him to tell me what was on his mind. He said, money, honey, yes, money, honey, yes, money, honey, if you want to stay here with me.
Well, that was Money Honey by LMA Morse, and this is Marie McCary bringing you another edition of Why Don't Economists here on BCB 106.6 FM, a programme about alternative economics, different from how the mainstream look at the economy, an economy run for our benefits, as if people mattered. There has to be a better way of organising ourselves. And boy, has this been shown in my interview today. And it's with Professor Prem Sikka, a Professor of Accounting at the University of Sheffield and Emeritus Professor of Accounting at the University of Essex. He's co-authored quite a number of books, and he's a severe critic of the profession of accountancy and auditing. He's very interesting to follow on Twitter, and that's at Prem N Sikka, PREMNSIKKA. He's actually an advisor to the Works and Pensions Committee at the Carillion inquiry, so he has a lot to say about all the failures there, especially of the accountancy profession and the auditors. So, as with all my programmes, I started by asking him how would he finish the question, why don't economists?
Why don't economists develop policies that result in a better society for everyone?
When I first studied economics, I was told it was the study of how to organise society for the best benefits for the most number of people. Well, that's not how it works, is it?
Well, the difficulty is that often the interests of the elites get prioritised, the corporate elites, financial elites, accounting elites, and that is one of the problems. So, there are lots of issues because of numerous inequalities in the distribution of income, wealth, status, power, and these then have consequences in terms of what gets talked about, what gets addressed, how the policies are developed. So, for example, nobody's ever really said that it is good to pay people at the top 100 times the average salary and people at the bottom very, very little. And that is how the economy has been constructed, and it has huge consequences. One only has to look around in the high street now. For example, names like Maplin, Toys R Us are basically going to disappear, joining the likes of Woolworth, MFI, and other names like New Look, Debenhams, Carpetright are kind of teetering. And one reason for that is the huge income and wealth inequalities. So if you were to look at the government statistics, for example, you find in 1976, 65.1% of the gross domestic product, that is all the wealth that we create, went to employees in the form of wages and salaries. Today, that number is 49.3%.
Oh, that's shocking, yeah. And yet, if you really think about it, and somebody did say it somewhere in the past, the poorer people have a bigger propensity to consume. A rich person can only have so many cars, so many TVs or whatever, but the poorer people at the lower end, they need to spend their money because they're lacking as it stands.
Well, that is absolutely right. Ordinary people, normal people as I call them, they spend on everyday things, food, clothes, shoes, getting on the bus to go to work, getting on the train to go to work, and that really stimulates the local economy. So the interesting thing is the names I mentioned, which are kind of in trouble. So if you look at the bottom end, because people have lower income, therefore they cut down on discretionary expenditure. They're not going to go and buy toys. They're not easily going to be buying lots of clothes. They're not easily going to be going to restaurants. Whereas when you look at the other end, the higher end, what they call the higher brand shops, they're doing extremely well because the wealthy have a kind of income. So the economic policies that we have ended up with have kind of created this kind of our world and their world, and all kind of segregated economic sectors have appeared where the rich go to their shops and the people on the lower income or the middle incomes are finding that the kind of shops they use, they're simply disappearing. So that again has consequences for jobs and the local economy.
But it's built into the paradigm of current mainstream economics that the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer.
Well, I think it is built in, but after all, whatever economic system we find ourselves in, it is not a natural system. It is built by the institutional structures, the politics, the way the power is wielded, and that means it is all changeable. It can be changed. In accounting, basically, it is a loaded discipline. There's not a single listed company in this country where shareholders provide more than half the total capital. The rest is provided by, say, creditors. In the case of banks, it is savers. So if you and I save through a bank, well, we don't have the rights to appoint directors. We don't have right to go along and put down resolutions at the AGMs. We don't have any of these rights. So in many ways, the kind of economic policies that we have are kind of 100 years out of date. The world has entirely changed. But our legal system has not caught up with this, and any government which tries to change it faces major opposition from the corporate sectors. You know, they will mobilize people by saying, oh, it is terrible, it is lefty, it is Marxist. And then you say, well, okay, you look at places like Germany, are they really Marxist? You know, they got workers on their company boards. They have better productivity, better investment, and also higher wages for their workers, because when workers sit on company boards, their reps are not going to put up with the idea that money is simply drained to pay shareholders. You know, you look at Carillion, what's happened? The company's basically been borrowing money to pay dividends. That is absolutely crazy. It ran up debts, and those kind of financial positions simply can't be maintained. So our legal system, our political system, our institutional structures are simply not up to date, and they don't really serve the interests of a variety of stakeholders, and they should.
That's true. I mean, it's the same in Japan. Japan looks after its workers better. There's nothing like the difference between the managing director and the normal worker. I think it's, much, much less. And then you can't really say Japan and Germany are failed economies. They're doing very, very well. So it's a fundamentally British thing that the City of London has such power over the running of the country in a way.
Well, we have kind of mergers and takeover bazaars in which the livelihood of workers is sold every day, and that is not really appropriate in this day and age. And we need rights for the workers. So in Germany, for example, if a company wants to take over another company in Germany, workers need to be consulted. But when companies are taken over in this country, there are no such rights.
Yes, and then you get private equity companies borrowing money to take over another company, then selling its property that it previously owned and making it a much less stable company than it was in the first place, because it's got all these debts to service.
Well, yes. Financial engineering has a lot to answer for the decline of lots of British companies. And unfortunately, again, one does not really see any reform on the horizon. That's a real problem.
Oh, very much so. And I'm interested in your criticism of the auditors, that they give a company a clean bill of health and then a few months later it goes down, as in Carillion.
Well, yes. I mean, you see, the auditors, we have them now, are really the kind of innovation of early industrial revolution, early part of that. So where the auditors knew the local business, the assets could be seen, touched. Now you got in a world where there is intellectual property, bits of software. Companies make a great deal about their patents and logos and copyrights, and the auditing process is simply not up to that. And the essence of the audit model we have now is really that we have one bunch of capitalist, if one can use that word, capitalist entrepreneurs, that is the company directors, and they are really to be invigilated by another bunch of capitalist entrepreneurs, that is the accountants from the accountancy firms, and the auditee, the directors, get to select the auditor and pay the auditor. Okay, it is rubber-stamped by shareholders at the AGM, but that is really the model. The same auditors design tax avoidance schemes for their clients and then report on it. So it's a bit like going through the passport control at an airport and saying to somebody, well, sorry, I like to do something which sails fairly close to the wind, to bend the rules a bit. Can you tell me how, if you can advise me on that, please? Saying we accept you're the immigration officer, but can you advise me on it? Nobody would dream of such a system. And then even worse, these financial auditors don't owe a duty of care to any individual shareholder, creditor, employee, or anybody else. Yeah, they only owe a duty of care to the company. So if by hook or crook a company continues to survive, well, there is no comeback on auditors. And even if there is after that, there are so many liability protections that it is almost impossible to sue auditors in this country. The kind of example I give is if you buy a packet of potato crisps or a bar of toffee or chocolate, the producers have to make sure that the products are not going to do you harm. They have to be tested. They must not cause injury to current consumers or tomorrow's consumers. None of these things apply in the world of accounting and auditing. So auditors have what they call standards or benchmarks, but for work, these are also developed by the industry. And then when something goes wrong, you say, well, okay, who's going to investigate? Well, once again, these are the bodies colonized, professional bodies colonized by the same accountancy firms. And so this is a kind of a terrible system. You can't have a worse system than this. So, we don't have decent regulatory structures in this country.
I'm so shocked that you say the auditors have no duty of care to the shareholders or to the general public, that might be thinking of investing in that company. No duty of care, only to the company itself. Well,
that's right, only to the company itself as a legal person.
That's outrageous.
And, if you want any kind of a market system to work, you have to have kind of penalty and pressure point. When you're looking at the world of auditing, you find it is a very different from any other market, a guaranteed market. State requires that companies have an audit conducted by an accountant. In other words, it's a market reserved for accountants. So people turn around and say, well, we don't like the quality. And the response is, sorry, this product will not do what you want it to do, but you've got to have it and pay for it because the law requires you to do so. And then the legislators wash their hands of the whole thing and pass it on to accounting regulators and professional bodies, and they are so closely aligned with the big firms, nothing happens. So we are again witnessing this. We just seen this in the case of BHS. Now we are witnessing this in relation to Carillion, where the documents coming out from the inquiry are showing that basically all was not well with accounting. Company was engaged in very, very aggressive accounting practices, which means it was reporting profits, perhaps which were not really made. But the auditors were happy to go along with this, because why would they bite the hand that feeds them?
But this is particularly bad with Carillion because the government was awarding Carillion contracts to deliver public services based on the fact that they were a stable company based on the audits, which were obviously wrong.
Well, Well, it is interesting that point was put to KPMG, who are auditors of Carillion. That point was made at the Parliamentary Committee inquiry, and the KPMG response was, well, we did audits in accordance with the rules. Well, is that enough? The answer is obviously not. And the government saying that they relied on the published accounts. Well, the point I made earlier is that the accounts are prepared basically aimed at shareholders. They are not designed to tell governments or any regulator anything about the riskiness of a company. It's a point I made some years ago. I was called up to give evidence to the Parliamentary Commission on banking reform after the banking crash. And I said, look, any regulator who just looks at company accounts and saying, this will tell me something about the risks relevant to a particular industry, well, they're not going to get that information from the accounts. So in the case of banks, for example, if directors have been reckless in taking risks and somehow they end up making money because things don't really go belly up, everybody says this company has made lots of money, high dividends are paid. Well, on the other hand, by being reckless risk takers, they have sown seeds of their own destruction, as well as the destruction of the system. And looking at a bank's accounts, a company's accounts for 1 year or 2 years isn't going to tell you. What you have to take into account is how that entity fits into the whole system. What happens? How does it affect other things? And the regulators recommended, the parliamentary committee rather recommended after my evidence, that the regulators need to develop alternative sets of accounts so that they can actually see what the real impact of an entity on the system is. Well, that was, I think, about 5-6 years ago. Nothing has happened. The government's totally ignored that recommendation.
So even after 2008, it's just no regulation at all. But I mean, I'm seriously disturbed about the fact that there's all this outsourcing going on by the government, and the government has no idea really about the stability of the companies that they're giving all these very, very necessary and important public services to, and what happens when they fail. It's
absolutely
awful.
right. There are whole fundamental questions about our whole regulatory apparatus and its control. And there is little reform on hand. So your listeners would be horrified to know that we have nearly 30 regulators of money laundering. Now, how on earth does anybody coordinate? How on earth do they make sure that they collectively understand what is going on? Nearly 30. And one of these regulators, who's supposed to be regulating money laundering in the UK, would you believe is the faculty of the Archbishop of Canterbury?
Really?
Is a statutory regulator for money laundering. And I have asked various people, what does that involve? So far, nobody's been able to tell me, and maybe I will have to go to the Archbishop himself and say, can you please tell me? And not one of those is subject to freedom of information laws. You're saying, hang on, somebody's acting as a regulator, and we are not entitled to demand any information? How on earth did that happen? And my view is all this happens because of our corrosive political institutional structures. So governments appease vested interests by giving them all these powers. And the vested interests don't really want public accountability. So, we have to remember when David Cameron came to power in 2010, he said, we will reduce the number of quangos. So when I look at the world, like just giving you an example of money laundering, the number of quangos has increased. And if you're going to deal with money laundering, for heaven's sake, you've got to deal with some big banks, their accountants, accountancy firms.
Well, HSBC and I think RBS have all been fined massively by the USA for money laundering. So where were all these regulatory bodies then?
Well, U.S. authorities fined HSB $1.9 billion which at that time was a record amount, may well still be a record amount. And it subsequently came to light via another U.S. Senate report that the then Chancellor, George Osborne, had written to the U.S. regulators asking them to go easy on HSBC and not to prosecute it, saying, oh, good heavens, it's a big bank, and, we can't really afford the action against a big bank. Well, that, in a sense, is saying something is too big to fail. So,
well, that's telling you who the politicians are working for, and it's not for our interests. It's for the interests of all the multinational banks, the multinational companies.
Well, it's the same, dealing with accountants. So in about 2005, the U.S. fined KPMG a record $456 million after KPMG admitted, and I quote the Department of Justice press release, the phrase was criminal wrongdoing. In other words, helping people to evade tax, not avoid, just evade. And the documents showed that people within the accountancy firm were trained on how to conceal these practices. And they worked with lawyers and everybody else. And they even did a cost-benefit analysis within the firm, which went something like, well, if we violate this rule and that law, how much money would we make? And the other side was, if we are caught, what might the fines be?
Oh,
so the answers they worked out showed that it was more profitable to violate the laws and the rules, and the people at the top said, go ahead, do it.
Well, the thing is, I read about these massive fines they get from the USA, but I never really hear about fines from the UK government.
Absolutely. This is the whole problem. So, the UK accountants and bankers don't have a different genetic structure. There isn't anything in the British water which says, my God, once you take a swallow, you will suddenly not be doing these things. They're essentially part of the same kind of organizational structure, and that should have prompted the UK to investigate. There is no investigation. So in the UK to this day, not a single accountancy firm has ever been investigated, fined, disciplined, prosecuted, even after a court has said that the tax avoidance schemes they marketed were unlawful. I have documented a number of those cases, and anybody can download that book free on the internet, and it's called The Pinstripe Mafia.
Right, okay.
And the co-authors are myself and Austin Mitchell, who once upon a time was a Member of Parliament.
I remember him, yes. I mean, HSBC has been fined for so much wrongdoing in the USA, drug money laundering, all sorts of things.
But even when the banks have been fined millions of dollars, and even this country there have been some fines, though comparatively small, no questions are asked of auditors.
No, and nobody ever goes to jail.
Well, yes, I'm sure a lot of PFI companies would love building more prisons.
Yes. That's a whole other thing as well, isn't it? PFI.
Yes. I mean, the problem is, in a sense, you might say, it's really a problem with our political system.
Yes.
Our political system basically is entirely penetrated and captured by big business.
Yes.
Ordinary people feel anger, but they don't easily have a way of channeling that anger, that concern. So people really, should organize, work through trade unions, NGOs, constantly exert pressure on legislators, go to their meetings in the local constituency, ask questions.
Yes, well, people need to understand economics, the system, how it works against them, just not in our interests. It's totally captured by the multinational companies.
Well, these companies, fund political parties. So, for example, in the last general election, the big accountancy firms funded mainly the Conservative Party. Before that, they funded Labour and Conservative, because in earlier elections they weren't quite sure who was going to win. They hedged their bets, and many of the former ministers work for big accountancy firms. Some of them, perhaps some of the big names included people like Peter Mendelsohn, one-time business secretary, and he left office in disgrace, but within a couple of weeks he was a consultant to Ernst & Young, and he's obviously not the only one. Lots of others have done the same as well. So the firms are able to offer jobs to former potential ministers, not because they have an accounting know-how, it is because they have the political know-how.
Yeah, well, witness George Osborne and David Cameron now are earning massive amounts of money from various companies.
That's right. So that again is a problem. The political donations are a problem because they are able to fund political parties. So if you go to...
But it's also in the mainstream media, their advertising is how most mainstream media make their money, so they can't criticise. They have to be very careful as well.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't want to just leave people with the impression it is doom and gloom. Let's just look at our history, and we can say despite all the problems, the institutional structures, the skewed distribution of income, wealth, control of media, our forefathers, foremothers secured lots of advances. Universal suffrage, trade unions, welfare state, all kind of things have been secured, yes?
Yes,
so
and it's a shame that it's all been taken away bit by bit, and we're not standing up for all those hard-earned rights.
Well, the first thing is, let's learn from history. Second, yes, you're right, that some of these rights have been eroded. We only got to look at what's happening to the pensions at companies. But what that tells us is how the rest of us need to mobilize and organize so that we take action, we stand up for our rights. And, that is what's happening. So it's interesting, if you looked at the newspapers recently, some conservative politicians saying, oh, well, we need to charge people more for the NHS with taxes. We need to increase taxes to cover social care. And my response is, sorry, that simply does not wash. Because what has the government done since 2010? It's reduced the corporation tax extensively. I think that's given about 70 billion plus pounds to corporations in terms of tax cuts. It's reduced the tax for the richest. We have non-DOMs. These are essentially billionaires from other countries who live here but pay a very, very small amount in tax. We have all kind of tax dodges. Well, my response is the government needs to deal with them first.
Well, yes, I mean...
to the rest of us and saying pay more, because the implication would be that those people are dodging taxes now. They wouldn't be paying anyway. So the rest of us get forced to pay more, and that is simply not right. So we need to look at this kind of a data and force governments to adopt decent policies.
Well, also, the City of London does control an awful lot of tax havens. The British government has the power to sort out a lot of tax havens if they so desired.
Well, yes, they do, and they're called UK Crown dependencies and overseas territories, places like Jersey, Guernsey, places like Gibraltar. Well, these places need to be reformed. There's a very modest reform suggested in Parliament just a few weeks ago, which was that we want these tax havens to tell us who is behind the companies that are formed there. Often they don't trade, but vast amount of money passes through them. So if you want to catch somebody, you can't catch anybody because you don't know who's behind them. But the government is not going to force these tax havens, which are under British control, to have a register which tells us who the beneficial owners of companies are.
It's outrageous. It's so outrageous.
The other side of the story is if people look at the Labour Party's manifesto for the 2017 election, Labour is saying if we come to power, we will deliver these things. So you now have a kind of a clear blue water, really, between the two parties.
Yeah, finally, I really do think John McDonnell is not owned by the City of London, one of the few prospective chancellors, and that was the Labour members taking over their right to vote for the leader. Jeremy Corbyn wasn't the establishment pick at all, and he gets vilified non-stop in the media for that.
Well, I think they're a breath of fresh air. They are reflecting what many people are thinking.
Yeah, they're looking for
earlier on, the workers' share of the gross domestic product is now 49.3%. And that does not tell us enough, because that includes Premier League football players, the bank directors. So the ordinary worker's income is really being suppressed.
Yes.
Now, to do something about it, you need somebody who connects with ordinary people.
Yes.
And thinks about how on earth are we going to address this? Are we going to have a universal basic income? Would that be the way of addressing it? Would a higher living wage be the way of addressing it? Should we be taxing wealth? We have whole varieties of wealth, and some of the wealth we find around, people haven't actually really done anything to earn it. Labour's in the manifesto hinted that it is thinking about that. So let me give you an example. Some of the wealth we acquire, we all work, and that gets taxed, income tax. Some people make capital gains. They get taxed, though we can quibble about what rate. Some people make wealth through trade, through innovation. But a large amount of wealth we have in this country is simply windfall gains. So I live in Essex, and some years ago they put up the M25 around London, which was at a vast public expense. But what you find, one outcome of that is that a lot of land around the motorway suddenly became extremely valuable.
Yes,
so the people owning that land did not spend a single penny, but it's become valuable because of the public expense. So really what the government should have done, and maybe they should think about it in the future, should ask the owners of that land to contribute to the public purse, because they're suddenly getting rich, but they didn't do anything.
Well, there's the land value tax that takes care of that. That's been talked about for 100 years, I think. The same thing happens with the trams. When the trams are put in around Manchester, all the areas around the tram stops, the property increased in value because it's so much easier to get into the centre. But that's the beauty of it. There's a community of alternative economics building up with completely different ideas of how the economy could be run for the benefit of the people, the benefit of the maximum amount of people. So that is something that
we need to change. We need to change at every level. We need different economics. We need different, also organizational structures. Lots of people in the media are hung about corporations, but there are also alternatives: mutuals, co-ops, employee-owned organisations,
I'm
not-for-profit,
massive proponent of local public banks like the Sparkasse in Germany, because it's so successful. They lend for the public interest. Their profits go for the local public interest. They're just thinking of the locality in general all the time. Don't do any speculation at all. It's all for the local community.
Well, yes, that's right. And in other words, there are other ways we can organise the world of business.
You never find it in the mainstream media, though.
Helping small businesses more, and we simply don't do that in this country.
Yes. Because every pound loaned to a small or medium business results in more employment, more innovation, more everything to benefit us. But that's not the case for the big multinational companies. Well,
not only that, small businesses are the first ones to be hurt. We were talking about Carillion earlier.
Yeah.
So we're looking at about, millions owed to trade suppliers.
Oh, yes,
and they won't get anything out of the liquidation. Most of the money will disappear to banks. There is no God-given law which says that the banks must be paid first.
But then again...
We can change the laws, and I have long argued that when a company goes bust, there should be an amount set aside so that the small businesses can recover something.
That's true, but again, that's talking about the auditors, because they would only extend credit to a big company that's been audited as a sound company if the auditors have responsibility to the suppliers of these companies, that if they say it's a sound company, it should be a sound company.
Well, it's not just auditors. When you look at company law, I mean, the directors' duties are absolutely balmy. So we are told directors must run the company for the benefit of members, and if you decode the word members, it is called shareholders. And then it says, in making their decisions, they must have regard to the interests of suppliers, employees, local communities, the environment, etc. Now, what that means is that the whole thrust of managing a company is to enrich shareholders. And the way the legislation is worded, in case anyone wants to check, is called Section 172, Companies Act 2006. This legislation is unenforceable. So if employees, suppliers lose money, they have to rely on shareholders to take legal action on their behalf.
It's outrageous.
In other words, because the director's duty is primarily for the welfare of the members or shareholders, only they. Now, there's never been a single case where shareholders have said, oh, we will take action because employees or suppliers' interests have been damaged, and if that means we have to cough up money, that is okay. That simply is not going to happen. So our laws, unfortunately, are not really fit for purpose. They hurt small businesses especially because, to use an old-fashioned phrase, these little acorns will give birth to tomorrow's
Yes,
oaks.
it's so self-defeating in the long term, but then with very short term. I mean, you're tweeting a lot about the current Carillion inquiry, and we have to come to an end now with the interview. Do you see any benefit coming from the Carillion inquiry at all?
Well, one hopes so, but then I also said the same after the banking crash. And after the BHS investigation as well. Very little has changed, but maybe people have been really sensitized to what I would say inbuilt corporate corruption and saying, hang on, we can't afford any more of these. And I think if people show their anger at the doorstep through the social media, through the local media, come the election time, then you have a recipe for change. But otherwise, change is not going to happen, and the organized, vested corporate interests will do their best to obstruct any change. So at the end, it is down to people, how they are willing to act and what they are willing to do.
And
change is not going to happen on its own.
There could be another financial crash, quite possibly, and what can they do then? They'd still try and hobble on with the same system.
Well, the problem is, of course, we all have a stake in the financial system. We don't want it to crash. Not only our savings, pensions, many other things are tied up into the financial system. And our financial system is also balmy. For example, you take pension schemes, rather than investing in real things, a lot of the money is simply speculated in the stock market. So therefore everybody gets locked into that, and this then has consequences for
into derivatives, that kind of thing.
Sorry?
They're speculating with derivatives and stuff like that.
Well, yes. I mean, derivatives are absolutely scandalous. And
just gambling.
I mean, the last time I looked at the value of derivatives, so you were looking at more than $1,000 trillion. And remember, the global GDP is about $78 trillion a year. So if the derivative market crashes, there is nowhere to go. And
they cannot be saved. It's too big for even the governments to save.
Well, absolutely. These people say the market may be that high, but the actual exposure of banks is low, which is not true either, because that is what they said at Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, but they sank, because then a domino effect kicks in. So if I can't honor my obligation, this has impact on you and the next person and so on. So yes, the derivative market has not really been looked at, And one way of doing that was to completely separate the retail banks from the investment banks, which we are going to do in this country from next year. But that separation is simply not clear-cut as one would like. So there is still a potential for reckless speculation to bring down the whole financial system, and I think it will happen.
Well, another thing that's happening that's interesting is that the whole alternative international financial structures being built by the Russians and Chinese, separate from the IMF and separate from the World Bank. And that would be interesting, and maybe currencies backed by gold. They're gathering their gold is very suppressed, and they're buying physical gold, and they've obviously looked at the Western financial system and decided it's not very good. they're slowly building an alternative.
Yes, I mean, the thing is, we need decent regulation. We need more information. So therefore, we need to peel away layers of secrecy.
Well, I think it's going to happen slowly, but it might be through many, many crises happening.
Well, the difficulty is crises happen and innocent bystanders get burnt,
yes.
Same as we've seen with Carillion. Those innocent bystanders included trade suppliers, employees. They will get burnt. Those who are speculating, they are in and out, and beside, they are not going to lose vast amounts. If you look at it as proportion of their total investment portfolio. On the other hand, if you're an employee already retired or about to retire, well, you simply can't go back and rebuild your pension pot. That is physically not possible.
So bad.
If you're a small business, well, it is the same. You're barely keeping your head above water, employing maybe half a dozen people, and next you know, a company like Carillion or BHS or Bird and Matthews goes bust, and you simply are struggling, just to keep everything going.
So, are you involved in the Carillion inquiry?
I am currently advisor to the Work and Pensions Committee, and I was also advisor to the Work and Pensions Committee on investigation of BHS.
Is there anything people can do to help you there with the Carillion inquiry? Put wind in your sails.
I think what people need to do is generate pressure for change. Because, as I was indicating, how little the world of corporate regulation has changed since the banking crash.
What can we do? Write to our MPs?
Well, no, demand change. For example, I came away with a firm view that if we had worker directors, say on the BHS board, it would have been impossible for its directors to do what they did, or at least, very least, they would have obstructed. Same at Carillion.
Yes.
If you had directors elected by workers, I don't just mean one or two, I mean at least half, these are large companies, then they would have prevented Carillion from paying excessive dividends, having huge holes in pension schemes. And we also need reform of executive remuneration. So when you look at Carillion, 2 years before its collapse, the remuneration of the chief executive went up by 50%, while the company is barely surviving. So if you had, for example, a system whereby employees voted on executive remuneration as well, would have been interesting, wouldn't it? Would they have gone along with this? To say it is okay for you to leave a hole in our pension scheme and we're going to give you mega bucks? The answer is that probably would not have happened. And once you change the structure of boards, you will unleash a different dynamic.
Yes, they seem to be so... Do they not have any shame? They're so greedy. They don't seem to care for society at large at all. I've seen reports that it's people with psychopathic tendencies that just focus on the bottom line and not care about the consequences of what they're doing, who tend to get promoted. So they're more psychopathic than the general population.
Well, may well be. The problem is that the tenure of the chief executive in the listed companies is shrinking. I think at Carillion, off the top of my head, I think it was about 3.6 years or something like that. Now, if you're only there for the short period, the emphasis is on amassing as much wealth as you can. You suddenly become a media star, paying higher dividends, reporting profits which may or may not exist, how rich you are getting. You become a media star. By the time the chickens come home to roost, you have moved on.
So there's no long-term thinking whatsoever about the long-term health of the company?
It is simply not there. You know,
Yeah.
The directors change. When you look at the share ownership, in large listed companies, on average, somebody's only a shareholder for probably 1 month. So they're not really owners in any true sense. They're more like traders and speculators.
Yes.
So if you really want shareholders to take the long-term interest in company, I would argue that we need a change which would say, look, you can't vote on anything unless you held shares for at least 12 months.
That sounds good, yeah.
So that way speculators can't move in. We're just witnessing that with the GKN, which is facing a takeover bid. Speculators are moving in. They know that if a company is bought out, you get a good price. So they get in. They might hold the shares for 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 weeks. They will vote on that and move on. Employees will have absolutely no say in it. They will simply be bought and sold. And that is not very helpful. So we need to change the board structures. We need to emphasize on long-term. And I don't know why we have these executive bonuses. I'm a little bit puzzled. So when you look at Carillion and I looked at BHS, the argument was that the directors were incentivized to grow the company, make it profitable. And my response was, and is, isn't that what they're supposed to be doing anyway?
Yes, we don't get bonuses for just doing our job.
In other words, by all means incentivize people, reward them if they're doing something extraordinary, not when they're doing their normal job. And besides, it is not a director on his or her own who can achieve these things. These are team efforts, collective efforts.
Yes.
All employees are involved. So whereas somebody's picking up minimum wage, but person at the top is picking up something very, very disproportionate. So we really need to change the whole system of corporate governance.
Well, that's think how we'll have to end, because that's it really. We need to change the whole system of corporate governance. It's really appalling in this country, and nobody ever gets punished for when they do things wrong and when the company fails. It's just
Well, it is, we have learnt really nothing from the banking crash and many other episodes. And, of course, we had a banking crash in the mid-1970s, and things changed, but basically lots of things have remained the same, and that is the real problem.
But I think there are people getting more active, and if there's many more of these crashes, it's making more people try and understand what is really going on. There's something wrong here. People are realising that there's something wrong,
Well, looking at Carillion, my response was, why on earth does the law permit companies to pay high dividends when they have a deficit on a pension scheme?
That's outrageous.
So what we need
I
to
didn't
say,
know that.
Same happened at BHS. Vast amount of money was extracted, though not necessarily as dividends, so there were other mechanisms used. So we have to say, look, if a company wants to pay a dividend and the pension scheme is in deficit, there's a very simple reform, that the company has to submit a plan to the pension regulator and to say, we wish to pay a dividend, but here is our plan on how we're going to tackle the deficit. And if the regulator feels the plan is not good enough, sorry, you can't pay a dividend. Same with mergers takeover. So I investigated for the Work and Pensions Committee the sale of Bernard Matthews, and you can see that report. It's absolutely free on the Work and Pensions website on Bernard Matthews. And what happened? The pension scheme liabilities were dumped. The amounts owed to supply creditors were dumped, and my response would have been the same, to say, look, when a business's assets are being bought or it is being taken over by somebody else, again, submit a plan to the pension regulator to say, okay, what's going to happen to this deficit? And has the new buyer got a scheme to address the deficit? If not, sorry, we can't approve it.
Well, maybe that's where it's going to happen, because these upcoming pensioners are going to realise they haven't got the pension that they thought they had. It's been defrauded off them in a way, and they have the time and the motivation to really fight for a better regulation. So maybe that's where it's going to come from, and they still have the energy.
Well, maybe it will come from them, but I think we all need to do this collectively.
Oh yeah, prevention is so much better. Yes, obviously.
Yes.
Well, we'll have to finish there, and hopefully, I didn't realise the governance was quite so bad. I knew it was bad. But thanks very much for the interview, Professor Sikka.
It's my pleasure, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.
And that was really interesting, learning just how bad corporate governance is in the UK. I mean, why can't we have a system similar to Germany? I mean, it obviously works for them. But the thing is, when you really think about it, society gives companies the benefit of limited liability. If you're a limited company, your home is safe, your wealth is safe, your pension, all this money that that they extract, it's all safe, it can't be got at. And that's a huge benefit, and society should ask for something in return, not just give out this huge legal benefit of limited liability willy-nilly. It should be that they follow certain rules for the benefit of society that's given them this benefit. I mean, at the very least, that they fund their own pensions and that they make some effort not to harm society. Limited liability should be a two-way street. Society should ask for something in return. It seems quite reasonable to me. Anyway, I'll leave you again with Money Honey by LMA Morse.
You know the landlord rang